So a few years ago, I got my first high refresh rate monitor when I did a new build. I got it home, I plugged it in, plugged in the same cable I had before, and didn't notice anything different. So what was going on with that? Well, I made a very common mistake when getting a new monitor, especially a high refresh rate one. I used the same cable and I didn't change anything in my display settings. So let's start off this advice guide here. And basically, how am I going to structure this? I'm going to go through each major component of a new PC build, and I'm going to give you an idea of what is at least one common setup mistake when you're actually setting up the components that you selected. And I'm going to give you at least one common planning mistake when you're deciding what should you buy in the first place. All right, so let's continue. This is the setup for the monitor. If you buy a high refresh rate monitor, you need to make sure that you are plugging it in via a cable that can actually support the high refresh rate. On some monitors that could be HDMI if they're really new and support something like HDMI 2.0 or 2.1, but many monitors don't, and you're going to need to use a DisplayPort cable to get that high refresh rate up and running. Now, just because you're using the main cable, the necessary cable, doesn't mean it's actually going to work for you. So you also need to double check, do you need to go into your display settings on your computer and actually change the refresh rate off of 60 Hertz to whatever your monitor can actually support. That usually needs to be done before you'll notice it. And then just move your mouse around in a circle. You're probably going to be able to notice whether it's super smooth or whether it's still on 60 Hertz. Jumping into the planning mistake for buying a monitor. I noticed that a lot of people, the monitor is kind of an afterthought. They put all of their budget into buying the best possible gaming components that they can, and then buy whatever cheap monitor they can fit in their budget. This is a huge mistake. If you're spending all this money to turn up all the graphic settings to ultra, then you want to make sure that things actually look good. And there's more to it than specs like refresh rate and the resolution, because there's actually like color accuracy. So for example, my ultra wide monitor here isn't just ultra wide, it also has really nice colors, right? So you want to look up reviews, think about the color accuracy. You also want to think about things like motion blur. I returned my first ultra wide monitor because it had a VA panel that had lots of motion blur that was absolutely unacceptable. It was just blurry on certain transitions. Look up reviews and save a big chunk of your budget for your monitor. You might want to keep your monitor throughout multiple builds or upgrades of your PC, so you don't want to cheap out on that and bottleneck your system with the monitor itself. All right, that's the monitor. Let's take a look at each major component and get you some more building advice. Now, if you're new to my channel, because it's less than 3 months old at the time of filming this, I'm covering PCs, technology-related content, a lot of it's news and leaks on new hardware parts, but also things like this, where I'm giving you build guides, advice, reviews, opinions, all of that. If you're interested in that type of content, especially if you find this build guide helpful to you, make sure you hit the like and think about subscribing to the channel if you're interested in more of this type of content. All right, I don't want to waste your time with that. Let's move along here. So the next component that I'd like you to think about, your GPU. When you're setting up your GPU, you're actually plugging it into the case. A lot of times there's more than one PCIe slot that this GPU could fit into on your motherboard. And some people are going for a certain like visual appeal in their case, or they just pick one. Well, you should usually put it in the top slot, although you should actually check your motherboard manual to be sure. Not all of the PCIe slots are necessarily at the full speed, and while this might not have a huge impact in your performance, you might not even be noticing it. Like, you might want to check it right now, guys, if you haven't. Sometimes you could lose a little bit of performance if you're in one of the slower slots. It's usually the top one closest to the CPU, but you can double check your manual to be sure. The next thing I want you to think about is when you're actually planning your build. So the GPU for a gaming PC is by far the most important thing you're going to do. So you want to budget as much of your budget there as you possibly can, but you don't want to waste where you're budgeting that. Some people will spend a lot more money for certain AIB coolers. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you're buying like a RTX 3070, assuming at the time you're watching this that those are actually in stock. Anyway, but assume you're buying an RTX 3070. The Founders Edition is the one at MSRP for like $499, but you could find AIB coolers that might cost $50 more than that. And I think a $50 increase is reasonable at that price point, but you can also find ones that might cost $100 more than MSRP or even more than that. And the point is that you're going to get diminishing returns where you'd be better off buying spending that money on a higher end GPU rather than a higher end cooler for a lower end GPU. Because the best the cooler is going to get you is a little bit more overclocking potential, which can get you a few % difference in your games, whereas buying the next step up in terms of actual GPU is going to get you much more performance per dollar. So don't spend too much on that. Look at all the different models that are available. Again, at the time of filming, stock's an issue, but when things are back in stock, look at all the different ones that are available. And honestly, my personal choice is to pick the cheapest one that's available for the actual card that I want to get, not worrying too much about the AIB cooler, because as long as it functions, you're going to get at least the stock performance of that card out of your cooler. Don't spend too much on a fancy cooler design unless you really want a certain look or something like that. It's fine if you want to do this, but some people don't realize they're wasting money on that. Okay, on the CPU, for your actual setup, this is going to be the scariest thing to actually install into your case, because most of the stuff, it's hard to actually break anything, but the CPU itself is going to have pins on it. Don't bend the pins. Okay, so that's number one, and as an added bonus, think about the thermal paste application and the compatibility of the CPU cooler. It's possible that you bought a CPU cooler, and I'll talk more about those in a minute, that said they're compatible with your CPU, but maybe didn't come with the correct mounting brackets, or you need to make sure you're using the correct mounting brackets for your actual CPU. Now let's get into the planning part of this. I think that the biggest thing here is not overspending on the CPU if your main purpose here is gaming. If your main purpose for your build is gaming, the GPU is more important than the CPU. I'm not saying the CPU isn't important, but the GPU is more important. So when you're allocating your budget, don't overspend on the CPU and have to downgrade the GPU in order to do that. Now, I'm not saying cheap out on the CPU if you can afford a decent one, but you don't necessarily need 16 cores or something like that for a gaming PC. Now, if you're doing other stuff like streaming or something like that on top of the actual gameplay, that's where it could play more of an issue, getting those more cores, or if you're going to do video editing, all sorts of other reasons. But if it's strictly for gaming, don't overspend to get more cores than you actually need. Research this thing and get a good CPU, but not overspending at the expense of your GPU budget. Okay, so next up is RAM. So with RAM, I'm actually gonna give you a bonus for both the planning and the setup on here. So 2 of each, and I could go into more detail, but I don't want this to turn into a RAM buying video. So number one thing on the setup is make sure that your RAM sticks are in the correct slots, or you're not gonna be running in dual channel mode, which will be a decrease in the performance on your computer that's easy to never notice. And you could be sitting there for years on this computer build and not realize you've been running in single channel mode the entire time. So check your motherboard manual. It will tell you the correct slots to put them in. Usually they're spaced one apart. A lot of times it's like close to your CPU cooler, skip one, and then it's the next slot. But don't trust what I just said. Check your motherboard manual to be sure you are in the correct RAM slots. The next thing that a lot of people, again, check this right now, even if you're not building a new PC, double check you've actually enabled your XMP profile in your BIOS to actually run your RAM at the speeds it's capable of running at. So when you just plug in the RAM and turn on your computer, install Windows, and start up, your RAM is going to be running at a slower speed than it's capable of unless you enable the XMP profile. So go into your BIOS and do that. Double check that your RAM is actually running at the correct speed if you're not sure you've done that yet. And if you're building a new computer, make sure that you do that. Next up, we're going to go into the planning your build on your RAM. And this is related to the first one, which was, remember how I said make sure your sticks of RAM are in the right spots. Notice how I said sticks. You should buy at least 2 sticks of RAM. Some people will think 16 gigabytes of RAM is 16 gigabytes of RAM and buy 1 stick of 16 gigabytes of RAM. That is going to perform much worse than 2 sticks of 8, even though both of them give you 16 gigabytes of RAM. And again, the issue is whether you're running in dual channel mode or single channel mode, so keep that in mind. Now, the next bit of build planning advice, I'm going to give you for RAM is don't overspend on this. So RAM will give you different speeds, right? It also has like your latency things, and that's even more complicated. I don't want to get into that here. But it will have speeds. So your RAM speeds, getting up around 3000 is good enough. You could do more, but at a certain point, there's a diminishing return on how much faster gets you actually noticeably better performance. And there's a diminishing returns again on the price you'll be paying for that, and certain motherboards and processors are only even going to support certain RAM speeds anyway. So one thing is, check how fast your motherboard and CPU can even support, and don't buy any more than that. But like I said, if you're getting around 3000, you're fine, and don't overthink it, don't overspend. And yeah, you can check the compatibility with your motherboard, but a lot of times RAM is compatible with your motherboard that won't specifically be on the compatibility list that they'll publish. Although if you want to be safe, you could try to select one of the ones that are on that compatibility list. Now let's talk storage, so like hard drives and SSDs. So for setup, a lot of times right now people are buying an M.2 SSD. So for setup, number one, make sure you actually have an M.2 slot before you do that. I guess that might be a planning thing. Bonus, there you go. And number two, a lot of times your motherboard will have more than one slot for your M.2 drives. I have 2 M.2 slots on my motherboard. Now, if you check your motherboard manual, it will actually tell you, again, check that motherboard manual, guys. It's a good thing to do. It'll tell you if your M.2 slot is going to disable certain SATA connections on your computer. So you want to make sure if you're using those SATA connections for something that you're not plugging into the wrong M.2 slot that's going to block off those SATA connections, or vice versa. You could adjust your SATA connections to not be using the ones that your M.2 drive is going to be interfering with. The next thing is the planning, okay? So when you're planning this, so first of all, for storage, I'm gonna tell you right now, I actually would consider it a build mistake not to get an SSD. If you just get a hard drive, now I'm not saying you can't get a hard drive for extra massive storage, okay? That's fine. But if your computer does not have an SSD that it's actually installing the operating system on and your most commonly used programs, I consider that a building mistake unless you are on the absolute tightest budget and you just absolutely cannot do that for any reason. Having an SSD in your computer is going to be one of the most noticeable things you can do to make it feel fast when you're just using it for general purposes. Absolutely do get an SSD. Now, with that being said, here's bonus planning advice. Not all SSDs are created equal. But they're all going to be, a lot faster than your hard drives. Although I would just say look up reviews, okay? Don't be afraid of getting, if you have to for affordability, a SATA drive, like a 2.5-inch drive. It doesn't have to be an M.2 drive, and the M.2 drive doesn't even have to be NVMe, although those will all get faster. Look up actual reviews of the one you're getting, and the main thing you want to do, like I said, is look at reviews of the specific drive that you are thinking of. Some of them don't have like a DRAM cache or something like that, which is going to make their sustained speeds not actually very good for anything other than super short transfers. So again, check the reviews, check the reviews for the particular drive that you're getting. Not all SSDs are created equal. You don't need to necessarily get the absolute best, but you don't want to buy one that's going to be garbage for you. Now let's talk motherboard. I also want to mention that I'm going to include like a summary outline of all this information in the description to this video, so you can find all of this there for quick reference. Anyway, motherboards. So for the setup of your motherboard, the main thing is to make sure that you read your motherboard manual, especially when you're installing things like your little header pins and stuff like that, because that's going to save you a big headache. And the other thing, kind of maybe as a bonus here, is you should strongly consider building your computer on the motherboard outside of your actual computer case to make sure all of your components actually work, because it could be easier to diagnose any issues if you do it that way. For example, if you build in your case, you get everything in there, and then you turn on your computer and something doesn't work. When you're actually trying to diagnose what's going wrong, that'll be harder if you're actually in the case than if you've built it out of the box, like on top of the motherboard box or something like that. All right, now let's get into the planning your build. So planning your build with your motherboard. This is gonna be one of the easiest places to overspend. Make sure that you're buying a motherboard that is compatible with your CPU, and make sure that it has all of the features that you need, like how many USB ports and all of those types of things do you actually need. Because when you move up to the higher end platforms, yeah, you can get some more connectivity, but you may or may not need that. And then you might get some other little features. You can look at those lists, but do you actually need any of that? Because a lot of what you're going to pay for on the much more expensive motherboards is really just for overclocking. So if you're not planning on doing extreme overclocking, where you need to pay a lot of attention to the power delivery systems and things like that, don't overspend on that motherboard, because if you spend a whole bunch to get a motherboard that can overclock a whole bunch, but you had to buy a worse CPU and or GPU in order to do that, your overall build will be worse, even if you're even if you're able to overclock it at extreme levels. It's still going to be better just to not overspend on the motherboard so you can spend that money on other stuff, okay? Let's talk power supply. So for the setup of your power supply, there's a lot of things I could have picked here, but I'm gonna say this one. A lot of modular power supplies, you might think that you might have an old one and you can use some of the modular cables from the old one on your new one. Do not do that. This could actually destroy your computer. Do not mix and match modular power cables that did not come specifically with your power supply. And if you need more cables for that power supply, very carefully research the exact correct ones to buy for that power supply. Do not mix and match or just assume because it looks like it'll plug into the same slot that it's going to work. The way the wiring is set up might not work and could actually destroy all those expensive things in your computer. Now, on the planning side of things, this is very common advice, but it's also very important. The quality is extremely important for your power supply. It's not just about the watts. Okay, you might get 1,000 watts on this thing, but it could be a piece of junk that could actually damage your computer. Don't do that. Buy one that has enough watts. Yeah, you do need to make sure you have enough watts. Like, look at what your GPU is rated for. Or do something like PC Part Picker. It can give you an idea of how many watts you'll actually be drawing from your system. But then make sure you're getting a reputable brand. Look up reviews. Don't cheap out here. You don't want to destroy your entire computer. It does happen, guys. Okay, let's talk CPU cooler real quick. So on CPU cooler, you've got a couple of issues for your setup. Number one, make sure you're using the correct brackets for your CPU and motherboard. There could be different ones included in the case, in the packaging. Make sure you're using the correct one. Also, some of them will rotate different directions and fit RAM heights better, a certain direction compared to others. That's only an issue on certain ones. And then also think about whether it has pre-installed thermal paste or thermal solution on there, or whether you're gonna actually need to apply some thermal paste yourself. That's pretty important. Okay, now on the planning side of the CPU coolers, I'll say double check it's going to fit in your case and it's gonna fit your RAM. Also, don't over or underspend on this. A super cheap one might not actually be better than like a stock cooler, assuming your CPU came with one. But a really expensive one is going to, again, be something that could be diminishing returns. Sure, you might be able to overclock a little bit higher, but could that extra budget have been spent on just buying a better component in the first place? And that brings me to the case. This is going to be the last thing I finish up here with. So with your actual setup of the case, think about where you're going to place it. Placing it directly on carpet is not the best idea, especially if you have air intakes on the bottom of the case, which some do. You don't want to be drawing in dust, you don't want to be blocking off those air intakes with carpet getting in the way. So you could put it on something that rises it above the carpet, or go up on top of your desk. Something like that can really help out with that airflow. Now, on the actual planning side of things, so for the case, one thing here is you could easily overspend. You can buy a lot of really expensive cases out there, which are really cool and can be a dream to build in and look beautiful, but aren't necessarily increasing the performance of your computer. Now, with that being said, buying something that's a complete piece of junk, you might want to check that it actually has reviews about the airflow, make sure that it has enough airflow, and that's not going to be a huge issue. Although I will say that the particular case I have right now, I didn't really check airflow reviews, and it turns out it has terrible airflow reviews. But honestly, my temps are a little higher than they could be, but it's not that big of a deal. I'm not thermal throttling badly when I'm gaming or anything like that. So don't overthink it, and definitely don't overspend on your case. But you should double check that the CPU cooler you're buying is gonna actually fit in your case, and also check that your GPU is gonna fit in the case. There's some big GPUs out there, guys, like the 3090. It's absolutely massive, but even then, on a smaller case, even a non-3090 beast still might not fit. So you can check, it'll give you a dimensions for how big of a graphics card will fit in your case. Double check that your graphics card will actually fit in the case that you're purchasing. All right, guys, I hope you found this build advice helpful. I didn't cover everything, so you guys can add some more stuff in the comment section. And also, if you enjoyed this video, found it helpful at all, like I said, consider hitting the like button or subscribing to the channel if you're interested in more PC, tech, gaming related news, advice, guides, whatever. I hope you guys have an excellent day.